The Beatles, the band that changed the world. Ever heard of a band that sold over 600 million albums, scored 20 #1 hits in the US, and transformed the entire 1960s? That's right, we're diving into the incredible saga of the Beatles. From their humble Liverpool beginnings to breaking up at the height of their fame, we've got it all. Buckle up, you're in for a magical history tour you won't forget. Chapter 1. The birth of the Beatles, from Liverpool to the world. Get ready to jump into our time machine, because we're heading straight back to Liverpool, 1957. This wasn't just any year in this post-war British city, it was the year a young John Lennon decided that he was going to form a band. Enter the Quarrymen. These weren't just a group of lads, they were the seed of what would become a cultural earthquake. But like any good story, the drama was only getting started. Along comes Paul McCartney, a 15-year-old who wasn't just good at strumming a tune, he could actually tune the guitar, a skill that left John Lennon amazed. The connection was instant. Paul was in, and so began a songwriting partnership that would take over the world's airwaves. But a duo doesn't make a band, does it? Enter George Harrison, Paul's friend. He was just 14, but his guitar skills made him play like he'd been at it for decades. Although John was skeptical because of George's age, one rendition of the instrumental raunchy and George was in, no questions asked. Now we've got John, Paul, and George. These three were the heart of what would soon shake the world. And let's talk about names. This band had more names than a blockbuster spy film. From the Quarrymen to Johnny and the Moondogs to the Silver Beatles, with an A, mind you, this band was searching for its identity. That is, until they settled on the Beatles, with a B, a tip of the hat to Buddy Holly's band, the Crickets, and a play on words, and they had a name as iconic as their sound. But wait, we're not done. There was one more change that had to happen. Ringo Starr had to take his seat behind the drum set, replacing their original drummer Pete Best. It was 1962, and the Fab Four were finally together. Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and Starr, the classic lineup was set, and the world? Well, the world was about to witness a revolution it had never seen before. Chapter 2. Ascending to Stardom, the Beatlemania ignition. We've got our Fab Four, but how did they go from being Liverpool's best-kept secret to a name that would leave an indelible mark on the world stage? That magical year was 1963. You have to understand, this wasn't just a year, this was the year. The Beatles released their debut album, Please Please Me, and what happened? It didn't just climb the charts, it rocketed straight to #1 in the United Kingdom. The album's impact was so immense, it stayed at #1 for 30 consecutive weeks, only to be replaced by their own second album, with the Beatles. Can you imagine that? Your debut album is so good that only you can knock yourself off the top spot. But hold your horses, they weren't done yet. The next stop was America. Brace yourself, because you won't believe the numbers. On February 9, 1964, the Beatles stepped onto the stage of the Ed Sullivan Show, and what unfolded was nothing short of history. An estimated 73 million people tuned in that night, more than a third of the entire US population at the time. The day after their appearance, everyone was talking about the Beatles. They had done the impossible, they cracked the American market, a feat many British fans could only dream of. This wasn't just a craze, this was Beatlemania, a frenzy of fans, music, and cultural upheaval. People weren't just listening to the Beatles, they were living them, buying the merchandise, mimicking the haircuts, and yes, screaming their lungs out at concerts. The Beatles didn't just arrive, they took over. Record stores couldn't keep the albums on the shelves, radio stations had the Beatles on repeat, and everyone, from teenagers to grandparents, knew the names Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and Starr. Even the term Beatlemania had to be coined to describe the sheer level of fanaticism that followed them. These four lads from Liverpool were not just popular, they were a cultural force that gripped the world. The youth had their heroes, the world had its icons, and the course of popular music was changed, forever. Chapter 3. The evolution of sound changing the game. If you thought the Beatles were just a pop sensation, you're in for a real treat. By 1965, these four guys from Liverpool were set on doing what no one else had done. They took off their matching suits, picked up sitars and tape loops, and began experimenting with everything from Indian music to backwards guitar solos. Yes, you heard that right. This was a period of incredible innovation, a musical journey that would lead us from pop rock into the world of psychedelia and beyond. So what was the spark? In December 1965, the Beatles dropped Rubber Soul. This wasn't just another album, it was a game changer, an evolution. Gone were the simple love songs, replaced with introspective lyrics and experimental sounds. But wait, it gets better. In 1966, they unleashed Revolver, an album so ahead of its time, it's often cited as one of the greatest albums ever made. Revolver took risks introducing avant-garde techniques like tape loops and reversed recordings, delving into themes of death, loneliness, and political commentary. It was music, but not as the world knew it. Then, as if that wasn't enough, in 1967 they released the magnum opus, the album that would define an era, SGT, Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Folks, this was the first concept album in rock history. It came with groundbreaking production techniques, instrumentations, and lyrical content that were previously unheard of. We're talking a full orchestra, sounds from the future, and lyrics that made you ponder the meaning of life. And the public's reaction? Mind-blowing. The album won 4 Grammy Awards and spent 27 weeks at the top of the UK charts. From Norwegian Wood to Eleanor Rigby to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, the Beatles didn't just cover new ground, they created it. Their musical transformations from 1965 to 1967 weren't merely a change, they were a revolution, inspiring countless musicians and shaping the very essence of modern music. In just 3 short years, the Beatles shifted from being the mop-topped Fab Four to musical pioneers, breaking every rule in the book. And guess what? They weren't done changing. But that's a story for our next chapter. Chapter 4, Shaping Culture and Society More Than Just Music. Okay, if you're still with us, you're about to find out that the Beatles were not just a musical phenomenon, they were cultural architects. They didn't just pen hits, they penned cultural shifts. Let's talk about fashion first. Who could forget those matching suits and the iconic mop-top haircuts? Everyone from London to New York was emulating this look, making the Beatles style makers in a world eager for new trends. But let's go deeper. In a time when the world was grappling with civil rights movements, protests, and political unrest, the Beatles didn't shy away from making their voices heard. They were anti-war, pro-peace, and they used their global platform to express these views. They refused to perform in segregated venues, taking a stand against racial discrimination at a time when it was far from popular. That's right, these 4 men from Liverpool were doing their part to change the world. However, it wasn't always smooth sailing. Remember the controversy in 1966 when John Lennon boldly declared that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. The statement created a huge backlash, especially in the United States, with radio stations banning their music and fans burning their albums. But Lennon's comment was less a boast and more a reflection on the intense influence and power they held over young people. This moment also signified how celebrities were beginning to rival traditional institutions in cultural importance. Interestingly, the controversy didn't silence them, it only made them more resolute in their social and political stances. They continued to sing about themes like peace, love, and enlightenment, and whether it was their public condemnation of the Vietnam War or their exploration of Eastern spirituality, they were far more than just musicians, they were thought leaders of their generation. By the late 60s, they'd gone from Liverpool nobodies to global superstars, not just in the realm of music but as vanguards of cultural change. From their fashion choices to their political activism, the Beatles didn't just reflect the zeitgeist, they helped shape it. They challenged social norms and invited a generation to think more broadly, more deeply. It wasn't just about the songs, it was about the message, the vision, and the willingness to risk it all for what they believed in. Chapter 5, The Breaking Point, The End of an Era. We've come to the part of the story that nobody wants to tell, but it's a chapter we can't skip, the end of an era. Picture this, the year is 1969. And on the surface, it seems like the Beatles are at the top of their game. They've just released Abbey Road, an album that would eventually become one of the best-selling albums of all time. Songs like Come Together and Here Comes the Sun are instant classics. But behind the scenes, that's a different story altogether. Tensions had been brewing for years. Creative differences, financial disputes, and the constant media scrutiny were wearing them down. Paul wanted to go one way, John another, and George and Ringo were coming into their own as songwriters and musicians, craving more input. It was like a family that had grown too big for one home, each member wanting space to breathe, to create, to be themselves. The tension was palpable, and it became evident during the recording sessions for their penultimate album, Let It Be, which was ironically named, considering how much friction there was. It all culminated in one final live performance that nobody saw coming, an impromptu rooftop gig on January 30th, 1969, atop their Apple Corps building in London. They played as if they had nothing to lose and everything to prove, giving the world a raw, electric 42-minute set that would later be described as both legendary and heartbreaking. Because, dear viewers, they knew it was the end. Later that year, John Lennon dropped the bombshell. In a private meeting, he told the other members he was leaving the band. The news stayed within their inner circle for a while, but by April 1970, Paul McCartney made it public with a press release, and just like that, it was over. The Beatles, the band that had conquered the world, were no more. The dream was over, but the legacy was far from it. Despite the tension, despite the breakup, they had changed the world, and that change was irreversible. It was a disheartening end to a magical journey, but every end is a new beginning, right? As they went their separate ways, embarking on solo careers, they left behind a catalogue of music, a culture, and a spirit that would never die. The Beatles were over, but Beatlemania? That would live on forever. Chapter 6, Eternal Harmony, Why the Beatles Still Matter. Here's where the magic lives on. Despite their breakup, the Beatles' solo careers would also prove legendary. Paul McCartney became a knight, and let's not forget Wings, his post-Beatles band. Ringo Starr found peace and even a new spotlight in his all-star band. George Harrison, the spiritual Beatle, continued to delve into Eastern spirituality and had his own chart-topping hits. And then there was John Lennon, the dreamer, who gave us anthems like Imagine. But the fairytale was shattered on December 8, 1980. John Lennon was tragically assassinated outside his home in New York, a loss that echoed around the globe. Millions mourned, but in the years that followed, something incredible happened. The Beatles' music didn't just survive, it thrived. As of 2021, their compilation album One has sold a staggering 31 million copies worldwide. That's right, 31 million. And so we come to the end of our journey, but let's ask the question we've all been pondering. Why, more than 5 decades later, are we still so entranced by the Beatles? What is it about these 4 guys from Liverpool that has us still talking, listening, and finding new meaning in their music? Is it the melodies that stick in our head, the lyrics that speak to us on a personal level, or the way their music became the soundtrack to pivotal moments in history? The truth is, it's all of these things and more. They weren't just 4 musicians, they were poets, pioneers, and, yes, even prophets in their own right. They tapped into something universal, something timeless, something that speaks to each new generation as loudly as it spoke to the one before. They said it best themselves, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. In a world ever-changing, the Beatles remain a constant, a reminder that sometimes, all you need is love and a good song to sing along to.